Good afternoon, everyone. So in our 2018 budget, the Victoria Police Department identified the need for 6 additional officers for frontline positions. These positions were needed to respond to 911 and other high priority calls. To maintain public safety, the Victoria Police Department deploys a number of officers in a series of roles, which can roughly be categorized into frontline positions and non-frontline positions. The frontline officers are the ones who respond to 911 and non-emergency calls for service, most commonly assigned to what's called our patrol division. Non-frontline officers are generally not the first to respond to calls, but are nonetheless essential in providing a range of policing services to our communities. Increases in calls for service, call complexity, and provincially mandated policy and disclosure requirements are greatly increasing the demands on VicPD officers. Injuries to our frontline officers has also had an impact on our workforce. That is why the Victoria Police Department requested funding for 6 additional police officers in our 2018 budget, along with 2 additional civilian staff positions. This combined request was presented to the Victorian Esquimalt Police Board, which supported it. The request was then presented to the councils of the City of Victoria and the Township of Esquimalt, and approval of both councils is required under the Framework Agreement. Unfortunately, we were not successful in securing required funding from both councils. While I am hopeful that we might be able to secure the required funding in the future, I have to address the staffing challenges that we continue to experience on our frontline policing efforts. Our frontline officers are busy. The volume of calls, the severity of calls, and the caseload per officer is amongst the highest in the province of BC. Policing in the 21st century is highly complex and requires more officers, more time to investigate. That is a reality. Despite the increased demands placed on our officers, despite the population growth in both communities, despite increased community expectations, despite Victoria having the 3rd highest illicit drug overdoses in this province for 2 years in a row, we have not had an increase to our frontline staffing in over 8 years. As a result, the only option I have is to reassign 6 officers to frontline duties. 4 will be going to the patrol division and 2 to our newly created alternate response unit, which we commonly refer to as the ARU. The ARU will provide immediate response by taking lower priority calls for service over the phone, and it'll reduce the physical dispatch of an officer to these type of calls. So it's an efficient way of delivering service. The positions that are being reassigned are as follows. All 3 school liaison officers will be reassigned. 2 work in the City of Victoria, and 1 is assigned to schools in Esquimalt. Our analysis and intelligence constable, our reserve program constable, and 1 of our beat officers from our community services division. Now, the 3 school liaison officers provide in-school presence. They participate in school and in community events, and they really are the main point of contact between the Victoria Police Department, between students, teachers, administrators, and also parents. The analysis and intelligence constable position provides investigative action and support to our intelligence-led policing model, assisting in gathering information and evidence. The analysis and intelligence unit provide all the crime analysis for the Victoria Police Department, including identifying crime trends, identifying prolific offenders, and providing criminal intelligence services. The Reserve Program Constable is a sole officer overseeing our Reserve Program, which consists of 65 Reserve Constables. The Reserve Constables provide crime prevention services to both communities, including support to programs such as Block Watch and delivering crime prevention programs, fraud talks, and much, much more. The Reserve Constables also provide augmenting our officers in the late night task force, deployments, and also our counterattack roadblocks. and traffic control at public events. The Reserve Program Constable also oversees a couple of other programs, such as the Crime-Free Multi-Housing Program and also the Victoria Police Bike Registry Program. And finally, the beat officer from our Community Services Division. They patrol on foot in the downtown core and other community areas. These officers often participate in proactive policing initiatives with the aim of reducing impacts of street disorder. They are often strong advocates for community-based solutions to the ongoing challenges of poverty, homelessness, mental illness, and addictions. So to summarize, this redeployment will eliminate the school liaison officers, their role entirely, and reduce sworn officer capacity in our analysis and intelligence unit by 1/2, and restructure the entire Reserve Constable Program, resulting in one less beat officer on the street as well. The reallocation of positions is not taken lightly, and it does not suggest in any way that the 6 positions were not valued or that the officers that were filling these positions were not doing their job or not performing at the highest level. In fact, they were. For example, I know how valuable the school liaison officers are. As a parent, as a past school liaison officer, and as a police chief, I'm convinced of the important role that they play in our schools and in our community. But even with that knowledge, I have no choice but to transfer them to frontline policing duties to ensure that we have the resources and the capacity to respond to calls for service. The primary consideration was organizational and community risk, both immediate and long-term. Positions that represent the lowest short-term organizational community risk were considered a higher priority for potential reallocation. Consideration was also given to the language and the principles contained within the framework agreement, our statutory responsibilities under the Police Act, and the collateral impact of the reallocation of one position on the other positions and functions and the ripple effect that it has on the organization. The overall assessment by the senior management team of the Victoria Police Department really was that no reallocation options are desirable, and that's just a fact. All reallocations will have a major impact on the services that are provided by the Victoria Police Department and the overall operations, but I can tell you that they're necessary as we move forward to relieve the workload pressures that we face on our front lines. We also continue to look at ways to be more efficient and to deploy officers in the best way possible, to limit our resource requests to an absolute minimum. The preliminary timelines, we will see these transfers taking place is between now and the end of June, so we're making sure there's a proper transition plan in place to move these 6 positions to the front lines. And again, I'll just finish off with this, that my preference really was not to reallocate any positions. I really do want to continue to provide a full range of policing services that our citizens expect us to provide. However, the demands placed on our frontline officers really require me to act now and to act quickly. I respect the decision made by councils. That is their decision to make. This is the reality of it, is that these positions are required. And I have to be able to, and our officers have to be able to answer 911 calls. When people are asking and they need help in both communities, and that includes Esquimalt, our officers need to make sure that they're able to respond in a timely manner. And what this really indicates is the need and the urgency that we needed these resources in place.
So can you point to examples of where you have not been able to respond in a timely manner and where the lack of resources has really showed itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just give you a couple examples. So, a lot of times policing is dynamic. We don't pick when the call for response comes or when the public demands us. And there's a number of examples that I can think of off the top of my head where, one example is in Esquimalt where we're dealing with a very serious stabbing while all the officers are tied up. There's multiple crime scenes. A suspect's left the scene. In fact, he's retreated to a residence in Victoria. The victim's now been taken to the hospital, so we've had to send officers to the hospital. At the same time, we're trying to secure the residence to locate the suspect in Victoria. Meantime, there's it's a pretty gruesome crime scene in the hallway and the apartment in Esquimalt. And then during that time, while our officers are tied up, there's a domestic that comes in, which happens to also be in Esquimalt. And so that domestic is a verbal domestic, which within 5 minutes turns to a physical domestic. So we've got neighbors and tenants that are phoning in saying that it's now got hands-on and they can hear the woman screaming. So officers now have to clear a crime scene from there and now have to deploy to the domestic to make sure that we intervene in a timely manner. So there's a host of calls, including just even the last 2 days, talking to the watch commander. During our briefing, we've had 2 stabbings 2 days in a row, right at shift change. We just don't have enough officers in many cases to even allow the briefing to take place where day shift can brief night shift on what's happening in the community so that the officers are prepared and are able to respond and protect our community as they should. So these type of examples are not one-offs, they're actually happening more often. And so it's really, really important that we deploy more resources to the front line so that we're able to provide adequate policing to both communities.
You know, Barb Desjardins has said that the school liaison officers are crucial in being the first line of defense before students can even get into a criminal element, perhaps. And in the wake of the opioid crisis, there have been overdoses at high schools across Greater Victoria. So how can you, is this sort of ignoring that proactive approach for frontline policing?
Yeah, so thanks for your question. So Mayor Desjardins is absolutely correct. The school liaison officers are critical, but I have to make the decision based on risk to the community. So the risk to the community is that every day we have drug traffickers that are trafficking fentanyl into our drug supply, and we have to make sure that the police department is actively targeting these drug dealers, because we actually have, in fact, last year, we had 91 people die within Greater Victoria, which is, again, as I was mentioning earlier in my notes, 3rd highest in the province of BC after Vancouver and Surrey. So I have to then prioritize, do I not follow high-risk sex offenders or monitor what they're doing, or violent offenders? What about the illicit drug overdoses that are happening in our community? I look at our community resource officers. So do I pull them? But part of the community resource officers are actually preventing crime from happening because they're dealing with the root cause of challenges that we face. So whichever way I look, it really turns out that there is no good option here. And the best option that we could think of, although I'm not proud to say that this is what we've had to do, that's the least worst option of a series of bad decisions that I've had to make, which is the best we can do for now. So again, I'm hopeful that this is temporary, that Police Services is going to conduct a review under the Police Act, and that we are able to fill these positions and backfill them as quickly as possible. And again, it's up to Police Services as to the timeliness of their review.
And do you worry that this is going to deteriorate the relationship with Victoria Police and Esquimalt, which we know in the past was at quite a low, and then the framework agreement perhaps improved it? Is this going to create another fraught relationship with Esquimalt, especially considering their desire for community policing?
Right. Well, I hope it doesn't. I think that the councillors recognize that to run the operations of the police department are complex, and that we've got to make decisions. This actually provides Esquimalt with additional services on the front lines. So when their residents are calling 911, we can ensure that there's an adequate response to Esquimalt. And so although I may have taken one Esquimalt school officer away, they're actually enhancing their capacity for frontline response, because that's being expanded in both communities.
Are the school liaison officers able to be called out for emergencies? Like if they were in a school and something happened, are they able to go?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll just touch on the school resource officers. I mean, we're working, I mean, there's no doubt there's been a number of high-profile incidents that have happened even locally in our schools, including the death of the 16-year-old at Oak Bay High. You know, there are, our schools rely on our school resource officers. There's no doubt about it. There are behaviors, worrisome behaviors, exhibited by many students that the schools don't know what to do. They turn to the Victoria Police Department because it's not criminal, but it's above the capacity of a counselor or a teacher or a school administrator. So the police are in there to be able to kind of guide and help and mentor and kind of talk about what the incident is and to kind of bridge the gap and to provide support. So unfortunately, that support will no longer be there because those officers will be back on the front lines, and we would respond on a case-by-case basis when a call would come in for assistance.
How long will the province's review take? When is there a deadline?
So we've had one meeting, and so that's something that I would encourage you to talk to Police Services Division on. I've briefed them on the news conference and our decision today. I've also actually talked to the Superintendent of Schools for the Greater Victoria School District earlier today, and just apologized to the superintendent and let him know that this is a step that I have to take, and I'm hoping that I'm able to kind of reinstate the policing service that we've been providing in the past as quickly as possible.
Could this be at risk, though, of not meeting the framework agreement, as Mayor Desjardins pointed out that school liaison officers and community resources officers were specifically mentioned in the framework agreement? Right.
So that's incorrect. If you look at Appendix A of the Framework Agreement, it lists the number of officers that are assigned to the dedicated Esquimalt division. It does not break it down by what they do. So the deployment is left to the Chief Constable to make sure that there's adequate and effective policing. And it was left like that on purpose to allow the Chief the flexibility to move resources however they thought was most appropriate. The other thing is, there is actually a provision in the framework agreement which actually says that should the board decide that the act isn't being met, and that's the Police Act, that there can be a change to that composition. And the framework agreement is a document that would defer to the provincial legislation, which is the Police Act.
Do you think that this sort of is a negative sign for a larger discussion about regional policing? If the two councils cannot get along and agree to fund resources, then how could Saanich, Bay and other municipalities, in the thought of having a regional police department, is this a negative sign for how well that would work? Yeah,
I don't see that. I actually don't see it that way. I actually support our regional police service. I support the discussions that are going on to looking at amalgamation between whether it's Saanich or Victoria or other municipalities. I think it's a good discussion. It's a discussion that ought to be had. But I just think that it's important to get police services to basically follow the dispute resolution process and identify what steps are required and whether these resources are required for the Victoria Police Department. I can tell you, we've had a review done quite recently which talked about more than 6 officers that's needed. There's no secret. The numbers are what they are, and they indicate that our police department is busy. And I can tell you that our officers every single day have calls waiting, and we're trying to prioritize and juggle calls for service. The other thing is, I have to look out for the welfare of the members. I cannot continue to drive them into the ground. We had a period of 6 days where we had 6 officers that were assaulted. And that was recently. It was reported in the media a couple of weeks ago. Everything is of concern. So I need to have officers healthy. I need them to be able to respond to calls for service, and I need enough of them to be able to do their job properly.